The year is 3021. There are no new ideas. There hasn't been a Marvel film in 2 generations, but even that's not enough to save the integrity of a dying media industry. The last journalist at Entertainment Weekly hits publish on their first article in 6 months. The CW network announces Vampire Diaries reboot in development. Here are the tapes. Hey Ingrid, how you doing?
I'm good, Flo. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Very medicated. Okay, so we're talking about Bonnie and Caroline this week. I think Bonnie first. I think you had some notes about that. This is a super smooth transition. Just straight into it.
hmm
No time to.
I'm heavily medicated. I'm a little medicated. Then bam, talk about money.
Okay. So Bonnie, number one on our list for today. What kinds of points have you brainstormed in the week since we last chatted?
Number one on our list, and also number one in our heart. Let's see. The thing about Bonnie is that she doesn't really have much of an arc um, throughout the series, besides the first season where she's figuring out how to use her powers, and that's kind of a moment of growth for her. She has to learn to overcome this new thing that's happening to her. But in the later seasons, that's less prevalent, I guess. She's just reacting to what happens around her and to what the other characters do, and she ends up helping them in some way or another. So it's kind of hard to talk about Bonnie in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
But about the idea of her figuring out her powers, how exactly would this work in this new context where she's going to be older, she's in college, she should probably already know something about how to use her magical powers. Have already talked to her family, her grams about that. So I was thinking, maybe because there's so many different kinds of magic in the TBD verse, she could have grown up focused on a specific kind of magic, which is more accessible to her, which is the magic that her family, her ancestors practiced, that Grams practiced, which is more like the traditional magic or the ancestral magic of her family that the show refers to. But she's recently been dabbling in and shown promise in other forms of magic that's a bit more obscure and maybe a bit more
Mm.
dangerous. And I thought that because I love the archetype of a magic user that is figuring out um, maybe more dangerous, more morally gray uses of their power to do some like really mind bending, reality altering shit
Yeah.
for quote unquote selfish purposes. I thought that could be like a good direction to put Bonnie in because she's the selfless character. That's her main personality trait in the show. So I want to see her use her powers for like maybe not so selfless reasons,
Mm.
I guess, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
I agree with you about that kind of archetype, and also, I mean, I think that she does that a few seasons in, but it is dark magic, and it's like has this super negative effect on her. I think it's the expression type magic. I think that's what they call it, and it just like
Yeah.
comes across as her version of being addicted to something in the way that vampires are, and so it kind of like enters that same dialogue where not only is it selfish, but it's like inherently flawed. And I think that, I mean, I don't know like exactly what you're like thinking about for this like new track for her, but like I agree that it makes sense for her to have already had this like grounding in magic. And it would just be nice to explore something, I don't know, less judgmentally for her.
hmm
Also, if I remember correctly, Graham's lectures at the university, just like as an aside. So like that connection that Bonnie is now like spending more time with Graham's because Bonnie is, I think, did we decide her major is history? I think.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think we ended up deciding on history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she would be like in close proximity to Graham's because from what I remember, oh no, Graham's lectured on the occult. I'm not sure. I think that would be, I'm trying to think what department that would fall under. And like, yeah, because you'd think that it would be nice to like pull Bonnie, if Bonnie's been learning from Graham's, to like to pull her away from Graham's a little bit in her like chosen field, and then also like her own extracurricular research. and that kind of thing. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
what I
Mhm.
wouldn't want to do, I'm like, I'm open to talk about this, but what I probably wouldn't want to do is like have her have a, like a dark evil mentor that's like pulling her down this like wild path. Like it would be cool to see it be like self-directed and that kind of thing. It's just like when we like search, when you go down like the Wikipedia rabbit hole, it's like that, but for magic.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I want her to do research on her own and maybe leave Mystic Falls for a while to visit different covens
Yeah,
and
just get
learn
out of
about
there.
different perspectives on magic. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
because her family and Grams like have a very specific view on, and this is something that TBD in general deals with that I think is kind of iffy, is that there's good magic and there's bad magic. There's magic that is practiced by good people that doesn't really harm others, and then there's magic that is used deliberately to harm others, and that's considered bad magic. So anything that kind of blurs the line between that and maybe is a sort of a disagreement between her and Grams, I think could be interesting to explore. And I'm
Mm,
not entirely opposed to the idea of her having a mentor that leads her down this path, but um, I just think that if they went down this direction, that mentor could possibly be a romantic interest for her, and I'm not
mm,
sure if I'm into that. But I don't know, I like the idea of like someone whispering in her ear to try to steer her in a direction and her overcoming that and not going down that
mm,
direction, but just being tempted by um, this knowledge. I guess I like the idea of magic being something that you acquire through study, through practice, and being a source of knowledge.
mm.
So
Yeah, because I
yeah.
think once we reach
Mhm.
the point where it's bad to know something, it's like, um, yeah, not to like date this podcast with a reference to recently released media, but it's kind of like that doxastic anxiety thing, like this idea that that was just in a recent philosophy tube video, that you can't
Uh-huh.
dig into you can't even look into something because you're afraid of what it will have you believe. You're afraid of like what it will do to your belief system. You have this like concern about being fundamentally challenged in some way. And so it seems like for Graham's, like that approach to magic and this whole universe's idea of not engaging in black magic or dark magic or that kind of thing.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's just like this idea that knowledge is a problem, which I have a pretty like fundamental issue with. So yeah, like I'm not super against a mentor thing, but I think that often that comes off as like I don't know. It just I guess for me it has the potential to undermine the like fundamental idea that she could just do it because she wants to, because she genuinely
Right.
does want
Uh-huh.
to.
Because it comes from her and not necessarily from an outside source. Yeah.
Mm,
I can see
yeah.
that how that could undermine the overall message that we're going for to try to give her a bit more agency.
I mean, we can always like invert the trope and do something more interesting with it. Like we could just brainstorm what's something that we haven't seen in a mentor character before. Because I think what happened with her in Expression was her and what's his name, who like had his own agenda that I think Bonnie ended up kind of playing into. But like you can totally like turn that on its head and have Bonnie specifically seeking out a certain mentor that has no idea who she is, and it could still be like her direction.
Yeah, I do like that idea of her like pursuing someone that she knows that is very knowledgeable and very skilled in magic, and
Mm,
her going after this person because, oh, you're a source of knowledge. I want you to help me, and her sort of growing in her own magical skill because of that.
mm,
But the only issue I have kind of like with this idea that I came up with is that Bonnie's main personality trait, like I said, is that she's selfless, and this
mm,
would probably be perceived as something selfish of hers, especially if she gets into like more negatively perceived magic. And I was thinking of like with Grams's death, what if she was like just so overcome with grief that she starts to get into resurrection magic and
mm.
tries
Yeah.
to get into that and dabble with that, which is seen as a big taboo among practitioners of magic in some circles. And I think that her Grams would agree.
Mm.
So maybe like Bonnie being selfish is too out of character for her, or is her original character just so devoid of any motivation that we could do this and it would be interesting and not
Mm.
completely out of left field, so to speak.
Yeah. I guess it's that question of is it selflessness that's a part of her character, or is it that her character is a crutch for other people to get what they want, like in a narrative
Right, right.
perspective? Like,
Mhm.
is it about having this kind of coherent idea of Bonnie as a person and why she would do these? And I mean, the Graham's point is like an excellent way to. I mean, it is both selfless and selfish, I suppose, in both senses, because she's doing it for Grams, but she's also doing it for herself because her Grams wouldn't want that.
Yeah.
Especially if we explore Grams not liking vampires very much and finding that to be kind of like this perversion of the natural order. It's very clear from the start what Grams would actually think about Bonnie doing that.
Mhm.
So I think it has the potential to play both roles and to kind of explore her Bonnie's desire to take care of people in what can become like a really maladaptive situation for her.
Mhm.
But I guess like my question would be like, what's the kind of climax of that plot? Like, obviously either she can't bring Grams back, or she can, and Grams is like so devastated to have been brought back that way. Like where does that leave Bonnie afterwards? Just because like I wouldn't want it to come across as like Bonnie being like humbled and then returning 100% back to this straight and narrow path of magic, you know?
Right. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. I don't know. I was thinking of Jeremy because his role as a medium could kind of like bridge the gap
Mm,
between Grams and Bonnie in the sense that he could communicate to her Grams's desire, and that she wants her to stay away from this path, I guess. So that could convince her temporarily to steer clear of this. But then later, when Jeremy dies and Bonnie actually resurrects him and suffers a huge consequence because of that,
mm,
then maybe that could be a way to tie into this initial seed that you've planted, that, oh, Bonnie's been dabbling with
mm,
some weird magic and she's doing it for not necessarily selfless purposes, even though in her mind it's completely justified. And then she suffers a really big consequence when she actually tries to execute that and it works out. So I don't know, maybe.
mm. Yeah. I think it would be cool to build to this realization that um, it's not dark magic necessarily. It's just there's a certain balance to the way that things are supposed to work, and sometimes there's a unexpected or just negative consequence to doing something that requires a lot of power.
Yeah.
Like Grams opens the tomb and whatever, and then she passes, and then Bonnie resurrects Jeremy. I have all my timelines wonky, but she dies after she resurrects Jeremy. Is that the
Yeah,
case? Like
she
she
does.
becomes the
Yeah.
anchor.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So is it that she dies and then becomes the anchor? Or no, she comes back and then she's an anchor that the spirits have to pass through to get to the other side. Is that how it works? Is that the chronology, I
I
think?
don't know, but we can open up the
Mm.
wiki. Shout out to the TBD wiki for being so comprehensive and wonderful.
Yeah.
But I
Yes.
don't know.
Okay.
I'm gonna check it out. But do you have any pitches for Bonnie? Any ideas about her character and what?
Um, I think that's a really interesting point about like the Bonnie and Graham's relationship and her like kind of magical journey instead of starting from zero, because it's a bit unrealistic to expect that she'd be in her 20s and like have no idea that she's a witch.
Yeah.
My only other point is kind of like a really big conversation that probably covers more than one writer's room session. It's just the conversation about how the show, I would say intentionally to play to its genre, just kind of builds romantic relationships into the realization of people as like their humanity is realized through romantic relationships a lot of the time. And the appreciation among fandom spaces is built on romantic relationships. And so, like, what that means for Bonnie to not really have had. Like, this is not because I'm saying that she needs a romance or needs this specific setup for a happily ever after, but it is kind of obvious when the only black character among your like main group of girls is constantly getting the short straw in the romance department. It comes off to me as just like it's not that she's totally independent, she doesn't need anything. And I just want to talk about, I mean, she has the Jeremy relationship early on, and that like also what we've already talked about that kind of plays into that a bit. And it might be interesting for us to look at why that relationship didn't really have a lot of appeal, which is because Jeremy was probably, I mean, he's the youngest of the guys. He wasn't very, I think if everybody's positioned to empathize with Elena, Jeremy's going to be everybody's little brother.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it just came
Hmm.
across as a little bit off. So if we did continue with that, we could probably build that a little differently. Like maybe have Jeremy have his like hunter kind of revelations separately or before, or just like bring them together in a more interesting way, or just brainstorm. Obviously, I would like to undermine the whole premise of the show, which is that, like Damon becomes a good person because he's in love with Elena, and Elena is this ideal person because people are in love with her. And like, I would love to undermine all of that, but I also think that it might be a good conversation to have about what Bonnie's romantic life looks like.
Yeah, it's definitely telling that in a show that focuses so much on romance and the characters' love lives that Bonnie is kind of the last to get a love interest, and even when she does, it's something that's very short lived
Hmm.
and doesn't really work out because she doesn't have characters
It's
that
so
are
sad.
constantly fighting over her like Elena does, like Caroline does.
Elena's got a backup, but Bonnie loses Enzo. Like, it makes me
Yes,
furious.
absolutely. And even not just romantic relationships, this is kind of an aside, but even familial relationships, Bonnie doesn't really have
Mm,
any
yep.
besides Grams, who died. And there's
And
that
an
weird
absent
thing with her,
father.
yeah, with her stepbrother
Yep.
as well. That's
Oh
like
my
that's
god,
weird.
I forgot
We
about
don't like to we
that.
don't like to talk about that. I'd rather not get into that. But like
Uh,
Caroline has her mom and has that weird
mm,
relationship with her dad. Elena's
yep.
whole thing is that she's recovering from the death of her parents, and she has Jeremy and yada yada
Mhm,
yada. But Bonnie doesn't have that. She doesn't get to have any meaningful relationship, be they romantic or otherwise.
mhm.
And I think that as for the romance part, the show really tries to make her seem like, oh, she's independent. She doesn't need a love interest. She doesn't need
Yep.
a man. But like,
Mm,
can't she have one? Um,
yeah.
wouldn't that
Why
be
is it
nice for
just this
her?
girl that doesn't have one? Even like, not even if we're just comparing her to Elena, who's the main character, but comparing her to Caroline, it's just so
Hmm.
obvious that Caroline gets to even have these like Caroline and Klaus, like these like kind of like enemy, like sexual tension kinds of setups that are so compelling for fandom groups. And then when because I remember this, or when I searched the internet archives 100 years later, I've seen that people identified these same kinds of setups with Bonnie and other characters, and it was kind of always rejected because Bonnie's too good for that. Bonnie's
Yeah.
too
Hmm.
above this. But obviously, this is just such a compelling dynamic. Like, why can't she explore that? Why is that not allowed? But yeah, you're totally right. She doesn't have the familial relationships either, and obviously in her friendships, she's this kind of just support system for what they're trying to achieve. And when Bonnie's parents
Hmm.
die, she doesn't get the same, from what I recall, she doesn't get the same grieving process that Elena is given. It's really a total departure. So I'm pretty sure that Lucy, I think her name is Lucy, Bonnie has a cousin called Lucy Bennett that's around for the earlier seasons, but not later. So it might be cool. I think she is unfortunately dies. So it might be cool to play that up a bit. And Lucy could even play a role in Bonnie's, like, her journey, like her different education. Maybe Lucy is kind of like separated from the main branch of the Bennett family because Lucy's been
Hmm.
involved in some stuff and Lucy's helped Catherine and that kind of thing. And so Bonnie intentionally pursues Lucy to find out more. And that's how that dynamic plays out. That could be interesting.
Yeah, and I don't know, maybe inserting a love interest there from Lucy's circle. Like, I guess
Hmm.
if Lucy has her own deal with other people that are not
Hmm.
related to Mystic Falls, the Elena circle at all, that would be
Hmm.
interesting. And I like the idea of Bonnie sort of bringing something back to Mystic Falls
Yeah.
that she has to deal with, like a consequence. So,
Hmm.
in her pursuit of knowledge and more power, she kind of like gets on the wrong side of a couple of people, and
Hmm.
then Mystic Falls is under a threat because of her. And
Hmm.
then sort of all the characters have to deal with that because it's always the opposite with Bonnie.
Yeah.
She's always the one who has to clean up the consequences of everyone else's actions. But it'd
Hmm.
be cool to see her like make a mistake and have to deal with that and to receive support from others
Hmm.
as well. I think
Yeah.
that'd be interesting.
What always gets me, like, in character dynamics, every single time it happens, it's just like hit with a ton of bricks, emotionally speaking, is when a character has like, they're having a really hard time and they're keeping it separate from everybody else, and then all of a sudden it comes out and it's like super emotional, and everybody's like, "Of course
Hmm.
we're going to help you. What are you talking about?" Like Bonnie, like holding on to the consequence and trying to figure it out all on her own, and then the resolution of that being, like, you came home to get help. Like, that has to be what this is. That
Hmm.
has to be what this setup is. Like, if you didn't want any help, if you didn't want anybody to know about this, you wouldn't have come back here. So you came here to get help. So here's some help. Like, deal with it.
Yeah, like there's no way we're not going to help you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it totally subverts the idea that the role that Bonnie has right now, because she's the one who's constantly offering help, and she's not allowed to sort of express her innermost conflicts and desires and doubts with everyone else. So she tries to keep it in. She tries to deal with it on her own, but then she realizes that she needs her support
Mm.
system to be able to deal with it. And it'd be nice if they were actually
Mhm.
there and willing and able to help her for once.
Mm.
I think that'd
Well,
be interesting.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, if it all
absolutely.
spirals out from Grams's death, then it's kind of their fault because they asked Grams to do it. They did that whole thing. It was for their
Hmm.
benefit, really. So the consequence that
Yeah,
Bonnie
yeah.
experiences, obviously, like it's still, she makes her own decisions. I'm not trying to like handle her with kid gloves or anything, but it's everybody's business. It's everybody's problem if it's coming from what happened to Grams because that was all of them. So
Everyone's going to face the consequences of their actions for the first time
yeah, we've
in
we've got a
TV
little
history.
scoreboard.
Yeah.
I think it can be interesting sometimes to have it like not fully something not fully resolved. Like, but yeah, there is frustration as a viewer when you don't even know if the people creating what you're watching have remembered that something happened. You don't even know if there's
Yeah.
like do you know
Yeah.
do you remember when you
Hmm.
wrote this thing? It's just it can be a bit frustrating. Yeah. So did you have anything
Hmm.
more for Bonnie?
Mm. I'm thinking about uh, trying to insert a potential love interest
Mhm.
here, but I'm kind of coming up
Yeah.
short. We'd have to revisit this topic,
Yeah.
but that's all I got for
Yeah.
Bonnie so far. Anything? Do you have anything
Not
else?
really. I'm really happy with the like what we've mapped out so far and what the potentials are for that. So that's cool. It would be nice to give
Hmm.
her a love interest who has like a really strong personality that is going to like play off of the Damons and the Damons and the Carolines of the group in a really like even
Yeah,
potentially
yeah.
antagonistic way. I
Hmm.
just think that's like funny. Okay, so we can totally put a pin in that and we should have a whole writers' room session about OCs, like what is missing in terms of the cast, and like not even to bring in someone that has like equal presence to the people already there, but like what's missing for different people and what could be brought in and just played around with a little more. So that would fall under that
Oh,
title.
I like
Yeah.
that idea.
I'm going to come up with some of
I'm
the
gonna
dumbest shit
just
you've ever
like open
heard.
up my drawer.
I'm going to come up with the worst stuff you've
just
ever heard.
just open up my drawer of
Yeah.
OCs and just like, oh, this one seems interesting. Let's kind of change it up
Yeah.
a bit. Okay,
Okay,
cool.
cool. So, Sweet Caroline. Not always Sweet Caroline. But I think we have already decided that her major is. Did we said journalism? Yeah.
Yeah, because she likes to get up into everybody's
Yeah.
business.
Perfect. And I think we already decide. I think we kind of like spitballed a little bit about more LGBT representation, and we said like Matt and Caroline being bi. I think.
By solidarity, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Cool. So I mean, it doesn't like necessarily change a whole lot about her, but it generates more potential. And I think if we are sitting here talking about love interest for Bonnie and more LGBT representation, that could definitely play into it. But I don't know why, but I am personally finding that hard to picture. Possibly because I watched the show originally, not even out to myself. So like I'm like totally shaming the whole community sitting here being like, what would Bonnie and Caroline look like? But we could definitely put a pin in that because I actually think that somebody outside of the group would maybe be a little more interesting for Bonnie.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, so we can just like keep, the word bisexual there and like because Caroline, I think, ended up having chemistry with like every single guy that she encountered. So it would just be nice to have like an open door for more. Like, imagine if we just replaced the Klaus Caroline thing with Rebecca and Caroline. That would be way more interesting, in my
Oh,
opinion.
that'd be very
Yeah.
interesting. That'd be really cool. Oh shit, that'd be fantastic.
Klaus is fascinated with Caroline, but Caroline is into Rebecca, and the Klaus and Rebecca dynamic of Klaus killing all of Rebecca's love interests. All of a sudden, if he's into Caroline, what happens? It's a nightmare. It's basically Elena and the
Hmm.
Salvatores, and he would be so angry about being involved in that dynamic. Okay, anyway, we could definitely figure out all of those different connections later. But for now, just like for the core of Caroline, I would like to talk about. I think we've touched a little on this before, but for the world building around becoming a vampire, like what that means for various disabilities and that kind of thing. And I think that with Caroline's control freak personality, like it's kind of made into a bit of a joke at some points, but I do think that if we accept that it's true that becoming a vampire makes you more of yourself, this has some interesting implications for certain patterns of behavior and thought that might even not fall under the category of mental illness, which is, that's like a contested category. It's not, it's certainly imperfect, but might not fall under specific psychiatric diagnoses when they're human, but could be very exacerbated by vampirism. And so having OCD, for me to think about what it would be like to become more of a to become more of myself and what that looks like. I would just be interested in chatting about what it means for Caroline to have more perfectionism or more control freak tendencies, or obviously that kind of thing comes from this core anxiety so often. So what do you think about that?
I think it's terrifying, the just the
Yeah.
concept of having my OCD as well and my anxiety to be amplified in becoming a vampire. But I do think it's interesting for her to, and for every character to have to juggle the good parts and the bad parts of being a vampire. So all of the good emotions, all of the good sensations, all of the good experiences, they are amplified, but all of the bad gets amplified as well.
Mm,
So yeah, Caroline becomes possibly obsessive with, I don't know, her pursuit of a love interest. Like she's super interested in like not being alone. She's afraid of being alone, and that just becoming a very real, tangible fear for her, and her
mm.
possibly making some mistakes in order to circumvent that and trying to prevent that. I think that'd be really interesting to see.
Mm. I guess like a lot of the anxiety involved in just being in your early 20s and trying to figure out your life, trying to map out what that looks like for somebody who probably has been making 10-year plans since she was 10 years old. Like, it just like,
Hmm.
what does it look like for her to be, yeah, trapped in that kind of headspace forever? Because if it does really freeze brain chemistry, for example, what does it mean for her to never really be able to
Hmm.
move beyond that point? And if she has children, as she eventually does on the original show, how does it look to parent people that may one day be, not because I'm talking about like mental age or anything, because that's a whole can of worms that I do not have the doctorate required to discuss or the experience or whatever. But
Hmm.
just like, what does it mean for her to plan her future and like have this incredible, massive anxiety to deal with all the time? Because I think that just the way that she is set up is
Yeah.
somebody who's so switched on all of the time. And so that would be a lot to handle as a vampire. And it would just amplify a lot of insecurity about, I mean, are people tolerating her or do they really like her if she's to becoming too much for them? And I think that it might even be realistic at some points to have her become a little bit too much for some characters, like to just for them to just be like I just need you to not, plan this for me. Like Elena saying, I need you to not have so many opinions about my love
Hmm.
life. Because of course, if she hasn't been assaulted by Damon, then it's probably more appropriate for people to ask her to step back from that situation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Definitely.
yeah, I definitely think that amping up her anxiety and her neuroses could be more interesting. And the resolution of that being that she then has to identify different ways to handle, like different personal strategies to handle her problems, as we all do. But
Hmm.
I mean, I feel a bit shit saying that because, like, I have not personally dug in and dealt with my OCD. Like, I have a lot of problems already, and I intentionally am not getting help for them because it's so exhausting. So it's complicated. It's a bit of a like minefield, definitely. But I think it would be an interesting thing to have a question mark over.
Yeah. I'm thinking of like the question I would pose is what does recovery look like for someone who
Mm,
is, like you said, stuck in this very specific and very difficult to overcome mindset. But she's
mm,
immortal, so she could spend literal decades in therapy and trying to recover from that. So I don't know, that would be interesting. Like, would she tell her therapist that she's a vampire and like, oh, I'm not going to, I like you, so
mm.
we're gonna keep this going, but I'm just gonna let you know this face is not gonna change. But you can't tell anyone because of patient doctor confidentiality. So
Yeah, your part
handle
refuses to
handle
let
that
you
secret.
reveal their bias.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we could even introduce a supernatural therapist at some point. Like you'd have to imagine that it would reach a fever pitch with Caroline. I think
Hmm.
because I like when I first watched it, I way over identified on Caroline. Like I imprinted on her like a baby duckling. It was ridiculous. So, just for my own like personal experiences, when I try and make myself better, I often accidentally make myself worse by kind of playing into
Overcompensating,
hyper
yeah.
awareness. Yeah, playing into just a hyper awareness of everything. And I like to plan things out and plan out exactly what I'm going to do to address something and then just spend all of my time planning and do nothing. And it's really easy for that to look from the outside like I'm managing things really well. And so I think that if we played that into not to build Caroline into a self insert, but just acknowledging our similarities. If we played into, every it could look to everyone like she's really doing well because their main metric would be, is she killing anybody? And if she isn't, they're like, well, she's actually handling this really well. But there are so many like really harmful ways to be um, processing what's happened to her that don't necessarily look bad from the outside. So it could be
Mhm.
interesting to have things really come to a head with her and have no one really realize that it was that bad. And then she has to obviously seek help with some kind of like specialized group or person or something like that. Could be interesting. I think we are constantly taking people out of Mystic Falls, like with these
Like this,
stories.
yeah, like no, this is this is not a good place to be. So everyone just like maybe this could be like kind of a clue to the other characters that not murdering people and not drinking people's blood until they die or incapacitated is not exactly the best metric for how well you're coping. And then maybe other characters could realize like, hey, maybe I'm not really dealing with this onslaught of supernatural events in the best way possible. So
Yeah.
I think
Everybody
that's
goes to
the
therapy. Everybody goes together as
everybody
a
goes
group
to therapy.
therapy.
That's the
The w-
conclusion. That's season 8. Everyone's in therapy and everything's gonna be okay.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, I think and also, like, what that means for Stefan, if Stefan's helping Caroline with her managing her things, and he's imparting upon her wisdom that he has gained, I think that we probably need to talk about what goes into making a Ripper, because I just don't agree that it's something innate that they just
Mhm,
have that
mhm.
makes them a ripper. And I kind of wonder if, because I think in Legacies, the spin off, it's kind of implied at a certain point that one character is more likely to become a ripper because he has ADHD and because
Ooh.
what basically happens is one vampire teenager tries to like get another vampire teenager to feed directly from people in the town, and then a teacher of theirs, Dorian, tells them that it tells the like bad boy vampire in this dynamic, the Damon Salvatore of this situation, basically you can't do that. He's like got ADHD and he's got all these things. You can't just like do this to him. You don't know what it's going to look like for him to feed from people compared to you feeding from people,
Mhm,
which
mhm.
that's quite a like weighty connection to make. But I'm not totally opposed to the idea that when you establish certain patterns of behavior of complete abstinence and then complete, it's when you don't have what you're hungry for and then you
Yeah,
just have everything that you're hungry for that you could possibly find in a like 10-mile radius. It seems quite obvious to me that
Mhm.
abstinence is not creating the best situation for Stefan. So it could be interesting for Caroline to go down the Stefan path and then obviously have a really dramatic, like complete collapse of self, and she hurts somebody important, or she has just this total breakdown, or she stops feeding so much because she is so in control of herself that it has a really terrible effect on her physically. And then that plays into
Yeah.
Stefan's realization that maybe he just needs to be a bit less of a dick to people who feed from humans. Like
Mhm.
it's just not that straightforward.
Yeah, I like the idea of it stemming basically from the refusal to accept one's circumstance, I guess, to accept the situation that they're dealt. I don't want to say like their nature as a
Mm,
vampire because that
yeah.
I think has some implications, but when they accept themselves and this circumstance, then things end up going well. They end up controlling themselves a bit more because they put in the effort
Mm,
and it's less taxing on them. But when they absolutely refuse and I guess try to pretend that it isn't happening or that it isn't real, then the ripper tendencies could sort of come in to play there. So it's less innate and more how they cope and how they deal with this circumstance and this
mm.
situation.
Well, the interesting thing about when we separate a person from their hunger is that the more you ignore hunger, the stronger it gets. That's the
Yeah.
equation,
Hmm.
right? So yeah, I think that could definitely be really cool to explore. I like the idea of Caroline
Yeah.
being a total foil for Stefan and his worldview, because I think that he does a lot of really good things for her in the show and he helps her out. And obviously they have this like ultimate love between them and whatever, but it would just be interesting for her to call a lot of things into question for him, because I kind of want to humble Stefan a little bit. I think he gets to play the good guy a little bit too much and isn't great for his
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
himself really.
To question this idea that it's a moral failing on the part of the vampire if they give in, so to speak, if they end up killing someone, that's exclusively a moral failing, and that Stefan is morally superior because he tries his best not to do that, not to feed on human blood, but it's not necessarily a character flaw, but
Mm.
just
It literally makes him weaker, you know?
yeah, yeah, just
Mm,
another way to deal with the situation that's not inherently wrong, just like
mm,
not feeding on people, refusing to feed on people is inherently right. So just to
mm.
sort of serve as a narrative foil and that sense of
Yeah.
morality as well.
I think
Mhm.
there's a version of feeding from a human being that is morally neutral, which is that that human being knows what you are, and then let's saying,
Yeah.
"Yeah, okay, you
Hmm.
can feed from me." It's because it's not
Yeah.
even
Like,
always a painful experience of the way that they position it. So, yeah, like, it just
why is getting blood from a blood bank morally better than actually feeding actively from someone when the people who are
mm,
going to use that blood or who are currently using that blood didn't consent to it, don't know where that blood is going. So like why is it better to actually steal blood from a
mhm.
blood bank and take it away from people who probably need it in the hospital, you know? So
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, like, the blood that's in a human being that can just say consent and say, "Yeah, you can feed from me," that's not going to save a life. It's not marked to, be ready for a blood transfusion, right?
yeah.
Like, it's
Hmm.
nobody's walking around ready to be transfused into somebody else. I mean, it does like open up the vampire to being exposed for what they are, but you have to imagine that there are just that for somebody like Stefan, who is so interested in humanity and so invested in humanity, that he kind of would want to live among humans a little bit more. But the other thing that I have written down about Caroline, and it kind of like plays into, I suppose, her struggles as a vampire and could certainly tick off a lot of her control issues, is the situation with her and her dad, where he basically puts her through vampire conversion therapy
Hmm.
to like burn her every time she tries to drink from a blood bag. I think that originally, when we talked about doing this, I kind of thought that like we would just like cut that, but I think that it can be, like, poignant, and I think that if her dad is not the only LGBT character on the cast.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely something that we would yeah.
Yeah, because can you just, like, imagine her response to being basically shown evidence that she is out of control and being told that she should be able to control herself? Like, just that, really, like, horrible dynamic. I just think that would be it just
Hmm.
kicks up a gear, like, it becomes so
Hmm.
much uglier and more interesting, this
Yeah, and
book.
being told that by her father, like by someone who's so close to her and who knows her well, is probably something that really hit hard for
Mm.
her.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
and,
something.
like, her dad is enough of a control freak that he's, like, mind freaked himself out of being susceptible to compulsion, right? Like, he has somehow overcome this, like, fundamental truth of their world, which is that a vampire can compel a human, and
Hmm.
so maybe for her, that signals that she could find some way to just, like, trick herself out of needing to feed on blood and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, there's obviously like I don't think that she's dumb enough to not realize that there's a physical impact, like you will desiccate, but yeah, it's it definitely like realizes a lot of the things that the show flirts with, like the eating disorder, like addiction type thing that really manifests in vampirism and just like comes off as like this horror of people being excessive or people like needing to
Hmm.
control themselves in a
Hmm.
certain way. Like,
All of the metaphors that they kind of touch on, but they're not willing to explore in any meaningful way. So it kind of comes across
yeah,
as just condemnation of those things and not necessarily exploration. So
like I actually kind of like the idea that becoming a vampire forces you to deal with things that you were ignoring when you were a human and you were pretending that it was fine.
mhm.
Okay, also, speaking of reframing your entire sense of self, I think that probably, unless you have anything else, the last thing that I wanted to talk about regarding Caroline was the pregnancy that she eventually has. Because, like, I have positive and negative feelings about it. So I was just wondering how that came off to you when you watched it and what you think about it.
I don't know. I wouldn't say complicated feelings. Um, I don't know. I just don't have much of attachment with those later seasons. I guess
Yeah.
because I didn't like them very much. It just felt so like daytime.
Mm,
It felt so daytime drama soap opera to like have this magical pregnancy happen that I
mm.
didn't really appreciate it all that much. But I do understand
Yeah.
how it led to interesting things in the spin-offs. So I wouldn't change it because like legacies happens because of her daughters in part. So I don't know, but like besides that, I don't have any strong opinions about the pregnancy, to be quite honest.
Yeah, me too, because like I really love Legacies. Like I think it's the Star Wars episode is the best thing that's ever happened to television. But but I and that was enabled by Miss Elizabeth Saltzman. So I do like that, but I'm just trying to like pin down why I felt so kind of ambivalent about the pregnancy itself. And I mean, obviously because Candace Akela or Candace King at that point was pregnant in real life, that's why it happened. But I think originally they were planning to bring back Jo and have her have basically the same plot line. And I think that I would have been ambivalent about that as well because Jo was dead and like they just keep resurrecting people and bringing them back. And the weight of your pregnant wife passing for Rick is like all of a sudden it's just reversed because she's back and she's having babies and it feels like that's her only purpose and it just becomes really ugly. So in that sense, I'm kind of glad it was Caroline who is like a central character and not just bring Jo back to pop some babies out because you want them for the spin-off.
Mhm. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm trying to like pull apart what do I not like about it because I didn't really like that season, and what do I not like about it because I wouldn't want it for Caroline or that kind of thing. I think my main problem is that I don't like Caroline and Rick. I don't like them being in like proximity in that way. I would love if we could
That's a
just
big
get rid of
issue.
Rick.
Yeah,
I would
definitely.
love if we could get rid of him. And I think that if we don't need Rick because I mean we'll need to brainstorm a way to like fill in a few plot holes kind of bleeding everywhere because Rick is the connection to Isabel. But if we do find a way to kind of like excise him surgically, I think that Matt and Jo, that situation, and then Jo unfortunately passes, and then Caroline is pregnant, and then it's Matt. And it's not that they get together romantically. I mean, I'm not opposed, like, but like whatever. But I just think that that would take a weight off for me because I then don't have flash forwards to all of a sudden Caroline is engaged to Rick, and I'm like, what the fuck are you doing?
Mm, yeah, yeah,
And it's
definitely.
he was her history teacher in high school. It's really awful. I don't like it. So I just think that it would be cool for Caroline and Matt to have their like romance early on, and then to like go their separate ways but still as friends. And then all of a sudden they're like Matt is obviously because I think he loses a fiance around the same time, like in the same seasons as Rick
He
loses Jo.
does. Yeah, Penny. I think that was her name.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely.
Penny the cop, who he won't meet anymore because he's not going to be a cop.
He's not going to be a cop. Oh, everything works with this
Yeah.
change.
Yeah, and it means that Matt, and Caroline like, I think there's a lot of humor there as well, like, a kind of lightness. Obviously, Matt is grieving a lot, but there is just, like, something in the fact that they've decided that they don't work romantically, and now all of a sudden they're having these babies, and it makes so much sense for Caroline to want to be there for Matt and then to have difficulty growing into the idea that actually he's gonna raise these kids. But yeah, and my only other issue with the pregnancy is that she didn't choose to be pregnant. And at no point does
Mhm.
she say that maybe she doesn't want to be pregnant. It's this magical miracle that she's going to do for Rick because she's just a good person. And I hate that.
Yeah.
So it would be nice if either it's tweaked so that she has to say yes to the spell, or Matt says to her, you actually don't have to do this. I could have kids another way if I wanted to. I could adopt children.
And just to acknowledge that she does have a choice, and that's
Mm.
she has some level of agency over this decision, which is something that is very I don't know, very important
Mm.
to her, I guess. So just to give her back a little bit of agency would be
Mm.
fine. And yeah, I do agree with the idea of just like leaving Alaric out of this equation entirely. I think that is probably a big issue I have with
I'm
it.
happy with that. I'm happy. I mean, there's obviously lots of fallout to certain decisions here, like as we kind of go through certain plots, we'll realize, oh, well, actually, if this is happening, then that can't happen or whatever. But like the Rick bleeder, where we've like just yanked him out, like we just need to cauterize that. Like we need to go through and like figure out everything that he actually does early on, and like just like fix that up a little bit.
We could just leave him early on. Like he has a big role.
Yeah, and then he dies and doesn't come back.
Yeah, like his main role is his connection to Isabel,
Yeah.
and once that is resolved, there's no need for him anymore. Like we can
Mm.
absolutely just fridge him, just
Fridge him for
get him out of
drama.
there.
Perfect.
Fridge him for drama, absolutely. I don't know for who, like who would miss him, but I wouldn't. But okay,
Maybe Elaine. Oh, he gets turned into the vampire that's killed for the curse for Klaus, not Jenna. Jenna's fine.
Jen is fine. That's okay. That's good. I like that. Just for Elena to have
He's fridged for
He's
Jenna.
fridge for Jen. Just for Elena to have like one more familiar relationship that survives besides her and
Mm,
Jeremy. Like I want them to have a family, like a some semblance of a family life
yeah,
together. I think that'd be nice. So when Jenna died, that hit me
yeah,
hard. So
yeah. It was really sad. It sucks that them being teenagers means that you have to get rid of like every competent adult in their life in order for them to like do anything.
yeah,
So Jenna
Jenna
lives. That's
lives.
our resolution of this
Jenna
writers'
lives.
room meeting.
Matt doesn't become a cop, and this is the ideal timeline. This is the good place. This is the good timeline.
Yeah, we're in the good place.